You can tell everything about a person by the way they treat someone who can do nothing for them. The laughter started before the $20 bill even touched the floor. It fluttered through the air beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, spinning once before landing near a pair of worn sneakers. For a moment, nobody moved. Then every eye in the ballroom followed the same path downward. Ethan Brooks stared at the bill resting on the polished marble floor between his feet. Around him, glasses of sparkling water caught the light. Expensive watches gleamed beneath tailored sleeves. Soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers mounted high above the crowd. The entire room smelled faintly of cedarwood, fresh flowers, and money. Richard Whitmore stood near the center of it all, one hand tucked into the pocket of a navy suit that probably cost more than Ethan's mother earned in 3 months. The billionaire's smile spread slowly as several guests chuckled beside him. "Go ahead, kid," Richard said. "Buy yourself something nice." More laughter. Not cruel enough to shock anyone, just comfortable enough to blend into the evening. The kind of laughter people used when they wanted to stay on the powerful man's good side. Ethan's mother froze beside a serving cart covered in silver trays. Monica Brooks had worked for Richard Whitmore for nearly 8 years. 8 years of arriving before sunrise. 8 years of cleaning floors no one noticed and polishing windows no one remembered existed. Tonight, she had spent 6 hours helping prepare the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala, making sure every tablecloth sat perfectly straight and every glass reflected the chandelier light like a mirror. Now she stood perfectly still, her hands tightening around a folded linen towel. "Richard," one woman said with an awkward laugh, "he's just a kid." "Exactly," Richard replied. "Kids should learn early. The world rewards people who know their place." A few guests nodded. Others looked away. Ethan said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the $20 bill. The room waited. Some expected embarrassment. Some expected anger. Some simply wanted entertainment. Instead, Ethan slowly bent down and picked up the money. His movements were calm, deliberate. The bill disappeared into the pocket of his gray jacket. No argument. No protest. No reaction at all. Something about that silence caused a brief shift in the room. Richard's smile faltered for half a second. Then it returned. "Smart kid," he said. "At least he understands opportunity." More laughter followed, though not quite as loudly this time. Ethan looked up. His dark eyes met Richard's for only a moment. Not challenging, not fearful, just observant, like he was memorizing something. Then he turned away. Across the ballroom, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago skyline. The city lights shimmered against the glass like scattered stars. Ethan walked toward them quietly while conversations resumed behind him. Monica watched her son go, concern pulling at her expression. She knew that look. Ethan wore it whenever he disappeared into his thoughts, whenever he saw something nobody else noticed, whenever he was trying very hard not to say exactly what was on his mind. Near the windows, a massive portrait hung above a dark walnut fireplace. Most guests ignored it. They were too busy discussing investments, vacation homes, and market forecasts. But Ethan stopped. His gaze settled on the framed photograph. An older man sat behind a chessboard, his fingers resting lightly against a night piece. The photograph was black and white. The man's eyes seemed almost alive. Thoughtful, patient, dangerous. Ethan stared longer than anyone else ever did. Behind him, Richard's booming voice echoed through the ballroom once again. "Ladies and gentlemen," the billionaire announced, lifting a glass. "Tonight we celebrate excellence." Applause filled the room. Ethan never turned around. His attention remained fixed on the photograph. Because unlike everyone else in that ballroom, he recognized the man in the frame immediately. And for the first time all evening, something changed in his expression. Not anger, not humiliation. Something far quieter. Something that looked almost like purpose. The applause rolled through the ballroom like distant thunder, rising and fading beneath the glittering chandeliers. Waiters moved between tables carrying silver trays filled with desserts that looked too perfect to eat. Guests returned to conversations about stock portfolios, private golf clubs, and vacation properties along the California coast. Yet Ethan remained standing in front of the photograph. The man in the frame seemed untouched by the noise surrounding him. His fingers rested beside a chessboard. His expression carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime thinking several moves ahead. Ethan felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He had seen that photograph before. Not the exact copy hanging above Richard Whitmore's fireplace, but the image itself. Years ago, it had appeared in an old magazine tucked away inside a cardboard box in his mother's apartment closet. Most people would have forgotten it. Ethan never had. There you are. Monica's voice arrived softly beside him. He turned. His mother looked tired. Tiny lines of exhaustion rested beneath her eyes despite the careful smile she tried to maintain. "You okay?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "I am fine." Monica glanced toward the center of the ballroom, where Richard was entertaining another group of guests. "Do not let people like that get inside your head." Ethan followed her gaze. Richard stood surrounded by admirers, laughing at something one of them had said. "I am not thinking about him," Ethan replied. Monica looked unconvinced. "Then what are you thinking about?" Ethan glanced back at the photograph. "That man." Monica's eyes shifted upward. For a brief second, something changed in her expression. It was gone so quickly Ethan almost missed it. "Come on," she said gently. "We should stay out of the way." Before Ethan could answer, a loud voice echoed across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could borrow your attention for one more moment." Richard Whitmore stepped onto a small raised platform near the fireplace. Conversations faded immediately. Wealth had a way of creating silence. Richard lifted a crystal glass and smiled. "Some of you already know this, but I recently added a very special piece to my collection." Several guests turned toward the fireplace. Richard pointed directly at the photograph. "Arthur Holloway." A murmur spread through the crowd. Even Ethan noticed the reaction. The name clearly meant something to many people. Richard continued. "One of the greatest chess minds America ever produced." More nods. More impressed smiles. "I had the privilege of knowing him personally." Ethan's attention sharpened. Richard walked toward the fireplace and adjusted the frame slightly. "Brilliant man. Absolutely brilliant. We played many times." Someone near the front laughed. "And how many times did he beat you?" The room chuckled. Richard's grin widened. "Not as many as people think." More laughter followed. Ethan studied him carefully. The billionaire enjoyed attention the way some people enjoyed sunlight. Every word seemed designed to pull the room closer. Then Richard gestured toward a display case near the wall. Until that moment, Ethan had not noticed it. Inside sat a handcrafted chessboard made from polished ebony and ivory-colored stone. The pieces gleamed beneath carefully positioned lights. It looked less like a game and more like a museum artifact. Several guests immediately moved closer. Richard's pride was obvious. "That board belonged to Arthur himself," he announced. "And yes, before anyone asks, I have played on it." Ethan stared at the board. Something about it felt important. Not because of its value, not because of its beauty, because suddenly the evening made a little more sense. Richard had not displayed that photograph by accident. He had not mentioned Arthur Holloway by accident. He wanted everyone in the room to see him standing beside greatness. And for the first time all night, Ethan began to wonder whether Richard Whitmore was telling the whole truth. The crowd gathered around the display case as if the chessboard itself carried some kind of magic. Crystal glasses clinked softly. Camera phones appeared. A few guests leaned forward to study the handcrafted pieces resting beneath the lights. Richard Whitmore seemed pleased by every second of attention. "Beautiful, is it not?" he asked. Several people nodded immediately. One man whistled under his breath. "That has to be worth a fortune." Richard smiled. "More than most houses." The answer earned exactly the reaction he wanted. Ethan remained near the fireplace, watching from a distance. He noticed details others missed. The slight pause before Richard answered. The way he adjusted his cuff links whenever someone praised him. The way his eyes drifted toward the crowd after every statement, measuring their reactions like a businessman reviewing numbers on a spreadsheet. Nearby, Monica quietly collected empty glasses from a side table. She moved carefully through the room, almost invisible despite being surrounded by hundreds of people. Ethan hated that. Not the work itself. His mother had never complained about hard work. What bothered him was how easily people looked through her as though she were part of the furniture. A few feet away, two guests were discussing investment strategies without lowering their voices. "That is the Maid's son," one woman whispered. "The one Richard gave money to earlier?" "That is him." Ethan pretended not to hear. Years of experience had taught him that pretending was often easier. The conversation drifted away as another guest approached the display case. This one was younger, perhaps in his 30s, wearing a charcoal suit and wire-rimmed glasses. He studied the board with genuine interest. Arthur Holloway's pieces, he said quietly. I never thought I would see them in person. Ethan glanced toward him. The man did not sound impressed by wealth. He sounded impressed by chess. There was a difference. Richard noticed him immediately. You know the game? The billionaire asked. I used to compete in college, the man replied. Nothing special, but enough to appreciate greatness. Richard laughed. Then you understand what you are looking at. The man nodded. Arthur was legendary. Some people still study his matches today. Ethan looked back toward the photograph above the fireplace. The room continued buzzing around him, but his attention drifted elsewhere. He remembered rainy afternoons inside their small apartment. He remembered books stacked beside the couch, pages filled with diagrams and notation, strange symbols most kids his age would have ignored. For Ethan, they had always felt like another language, a language that made sense when everything else did not. Do you play? The question pulled him back. The younger man in the charcoal suit was looking directly at him. Ethan blinked. Sometimes. Sometimes, the man repeated with a smile. That usually means yes. Before Ethan could answer, another guest joined the conversation. A woman holding a glass of sparkling water looked between them. You are asking the kid about chess? She said with amusement. Why not? The man replied. The woman laughed softly. Because he is 14. More people overheard. Several smiled. One guest chuckled. Ethan felt familiar heat rise in his chest, though his face remained calm. The younger man studied him carefully. How long have you been playing? Ethan looked toward the chessboard inside the display case. Long enough. The answer seemed to surprise the man. Before he could respond, Richard stepped closer. His polished shoes clicked softly against the marble floor. Careful, he said with a grin. You might discover my young friend here is secretly a grandmaster. The crowd laughed again. Ethan heard the joke, but something else caught his attention. Richard was smiling, yet his eyes had narrowed slightly. As though for the first time that evening, he had become curious about the boy standing beside the fireplace. The atmosphere shifted so subtly that most people never noticed it. One moment the conversation was a harmless joke. The next, curiosity had entered the room. Richard Whitmore rested one hand against the glass display case and studied Ethan more carefully than before. Not because of anything the boy had done, because of what he had not done. Most teenagers would have tried to impress people. Some would have bragged. Others would have shrunk beneath the attention. Ethan had done neither. He simply stood there, calm and unreadable. The younger man in the charcoal suit extended a hand. Daniel Mercer. Ethan shook it. Ethan Brooks. Nice to meet you, Ethan. Daniel glanced toward the chessboard. What is your favorite opening? A few nearby guests laughed softly. The question sounded harmless enough, but anyone who knew chess understood it immediately. It was a test. Ethan looked toward the board for a moment. Depends on who is sitting across from me. Daniel blinked. Then he smiled. Fair answer. The woman holding the sparkling water tilted her head. You understood that? She asked Daniel. Most beginners do not answer that way. Richard chuckled. Maybe the kid has been watching videos online. Maybe, Daniel replied. But his eyes remained fixed on Ethan. Nearby, another guest stepped closer. Then another. The circle slowly widened. What had started as casual conversation was becoming entertainment. Ethan could feel it happening. Wealthy people loved discovering hidden talent almost as much as they loved displaying expensive possessions. Monica noticed it too. She stood across the room carrying a tray of empty glasses. Worry appeared in her eyes immediately. Ethan knew that look. She was afraid attention would bring trouble. It often did. Richard reached into the display case and carefully removed a night piece. The polished surface reflected the chandelier light. Arthur always favored aggressive middle game pressure, Richard said. At least when he played me. Several guests nodded as though they had witnessed those matches themselves. Ethan studied the billionaire's face. Something felt off. The details were right. The confidence was right. Yet there was a strange hollowness beneath the words. As though Richard knew the stories, but not the experience. Daniel folded his arms. You played Arthur often? Richard smiled. Enough to learn a few lessons. And beat him? The question hung in the air. Richard hesitated. Only for a second. Once or twice. More impressed murmurs spread through the crowd. Ethan looked back toward the photograph above the fireplace. The expression in Arthur Holloway's eyes seemed almost amused now. The silence stretched. Then Richard pointed toward a nearby table. Tell you what. His voice carried easily across the room. Let us settle something. A few guests immediately leaned forward. Monica stopped walking. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Richard grinned. There is no gala worth attending without a little competition. Laughter followed. Someone applauded. Richard walked toward the handcrafted chessboard and began arranging pieces on the polished surface. The soft clicking sound echoed across the room. White pieces on one side, black pieces on the other. Deliberate. Precise. The crowd followed him like iron filings drawn toward a magnet. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Not from fear. From recognition. He knew exactly what was happening. Richard turned and looked directly at him. You said you play sometimes. Several guests smiled immediately. Others exchanged excited glances. Daniel's expression grew thoughtful. Across the ballroom, Monica quietly set down her tray. Richard rested both palms against the edge of the table. Why do not we find out how good sometimes really is? The room went silent. Even the music seemed farther away now. Crystal glasses stopped moving. Conversations disappeared. Ethan looked at the chessboard, then at the photograph above the fireplace, then back at Richard Whitmore. And for the first time all evening, he realized this night was no longer unfolding by accident. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence settled over the ballroom like a blanket pulled across a room after midnight. Ethan looked at the chessboard. The polished pieces stood perfectly arranged beneath the chandelier light. White, black, order, possibility. Across from him, Richard Whitmore waited with the relaxed confidence of a man who had spent his entire life assuming outcomes would favor him. Several guests were already smiling. They believed they knew how this scene would end. Monica did not. She moved quickly through the crowd until she reached her son. Ethan, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, you do not have to do this. Her hand rested lightly against his arm. Ethan looked at her. The concern in her eyes was impossible to miss. She was not worried about chess. She was worried about attention. Attention had a way of becoming trouble when people like Richard Whitmore were involved. It is okay, Ethan said softly. No. Monica shook her head. You came here because I asked you to. That is all. We can leave after my shift. Ethan glanced toward the fireplace, toward the photograph hanging above it, then back to his mother. Something unspoken passed between them. Monica saw it immediately. Her expression tightened. Ethan, she began, but Richard's voice interrupted. Come now. It is only a game. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Nobody is signing contracts. More laughter followed. Daniel Mercer did not laugh. He stood quietly near the table, studying both Ethan and Richard with growing interest. The kid can always say no, Daniel said. Richard spread his hands. Of course he can. The billionaire smiled toward Ethan. Can you? The question seemed simple. Yet something about the way Richard asked it made the room feel smaller. Ethan looked around. Crystal glasses reflected golden light. Expensive watches flashed from beneath tailored sleeves. Faces watched him from every direction. Waiting, judging, curious. Then his eyes settled on the $20 bill still folded inside his jacket pocket. He could almost feel it there. Light as paper. Heavy as a memory. I can say no, Ethan replied. Richard nodded. Good. A brief pause followed. Will you? The room became still again. Somewhere in the distance, a server set down a tray. The faint sound echoed through the silence. Ethan looked once more at the chessboard. His heartbeat remained steady, calm, controlled, exactly the way it always became before a match. Monica saw the change immediately. She had seen it for years. During tournaments, during long nights studying positions, during moments when the rest of the world seemed to disappear and only 64 squares remained. She slowly lowered her hand. Richard noticed. Daniel noticed too. Ethan stepped forward. One step, then another. The crowd parted instinctively. Guests moved aside as he approached the table. The polished marble floor reflected the lights above like still water. Richard's smile widened. Several people reached for their phones. Ethan stopped beside the board and looked down at the pieces. Not with excitement, not with fear, with recognition, like someone greeting an old friend. Then he pulled out a chair. The scraping sound cut through the ballroom. Sharp, clean, final. And for reasons none of them could yet explain, more than a few people suddenly forgot how to smile. Richard lowered himself into the chair across from Ethan with the confidence of a man taking his place on a familiar stage. The crowd tightened around the table. Conversations faded into whispers. Somewhere beyond the ballroom windows, The lights of Chicago glittered against the night sky, but nobody was looking outside anymore. Every eye remained fixed on the chessboard. Richard adjusted the collar of his jacket and smiled. "Well then," he said, resting his fingertips on the table, "let us make this interesting." A few guests chuckled. Ethan remained silent. The pieces stood between them like soldiers waiting for orders. Daniel Mercer moved closer, folding his arms. He looked less entertained than intrigued. Monica stood near the back of the crowd, her hands clasped tightly together. She knew her son. She knew what happened when he became quiet like this. Richard glanced around the room. A game without stakes feels incomplete. Several people nodded immediately. Wealthy people loved competition, especially when they believed the outcome was guaranteed. Richard reached into his pocket and removed a gold pen. He spun it once between his fingers. "How about a wager?" More smiles appeared. Someone laughed. Another guest raised a glass. Ethan did not react. Richard leaned back. "If I win, you keep the $20. The crowd erupted with laughter. The joke landed exactly as intended. Richard enjoyed the reaction for a moment before raising one hand. "And if you win?" He paused. The room leaned forward. "I will donate $1 million to any educational program your mother chooses." Silence. Complete silence. Even Daniel blinked. Several guests exchanged stunned glances. Monica's eyes widened immediately. $1 million. The number seemed too large to belong in the room. Richard smiled at the reaction. He loved moments like this. The reveal. The shock. The display of generosity that only existed because he could afford it. "Surely that is fair," he said. Ethan finally looked up. "Why?" Richard shrugged. "Because confidence should be rewarded." A few people nodded. Others smiled. But Daniel's expression tightened slightly. He seemed to be studying Richard's answer rather than accepting it. Ethan's gaze drifted briefly toward the photograph above the fireplace. Arthur Holloway's calm expression looked down over the room. Then Ethan looked back at the billionaire. "And if I do not want the money?" Several people laughed softly. Richard laughed too. "Trust me, everybody wants $1 million. Ethan said nothing. The silence lingered longer than expected. Then he asked a question nobody saw coming. "Will the donation happen regardless?" Richard frowned slightly. "What do you mean? If I win, will the money go directly to the program?" The crowd grew quiet again. Daniel's eyebrows lifted. Monica stared at her son. Richard chuckled. "Yes." In writing. This time, even the smiles began to fade. The question sounded strange coming from a 14-year-old. Not arrogant. Not emotional. Precise. Richard studied him for a second. Then laughed again. In writing. Daniel looked down at the board and smiled to himself. Something about the exchange had changed the atmosphere. The guests still believed Richard would win. Of course they did. But for the first time that evening, they were no longer looking at Ethan as a child sitting at the wrong table. They were looking at him as a player who had just made his first move before touching a single piece. The board sat between them in perfect silence. 64 squares. 32 pieces. Nothing more. Yet somehow it felt as though the entire ballroom had shrunk until only the table remained. Richard reached forward first. His fingers closed around a white pawn. The piece slid 2 squares ahead with a soft click. Several guests immediately relaxed. The game had begun. Richard leaned back and smiled. "Your move." Ethan lowered his eyes to the board. The noise of the room faded. The crystal glasses. The expensive suits. The quiet whispers. All of it seemed to drift somewhere beyond the edges of his attention. There was only position now. Structure. Patterns. Possibilities. He moved a pawn. Calm. Simple. No hesitation. Richard nodded as though he expected nothing less. Another move followed. Then another. White developed smoothly. Black responded. To most people watching, nothing remarkable was happening. The pieces moved. The players remained silent. The room waited for excitement. Daniel Mercer watched differently. His gaze moved between the board and Ethan's face. By the fourth move, something had changed. It was subtle, almost invisible. Richard was still smiling. Yet he had stopped looking at the crowd. His attention had settled fully onto the board. Ethan noticed it too. The billionaire's confidence remained intact, but the performance was beginning to disappear. Across the room, Monica stood motionless. She had seen hundreds of games. School tournaments. State tournaments. Online championships streamed through old laptops. She recognized the stillness in her son. It always appeared when he stopped playing opponents and started solving problems. Richard moved a bishop. Ethan answered immediately. The response came so quickly that a few guests exchanged glances. No thinking, no uncertainty, just movement. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. Daniel caught it. So did Ethan. Another move. Another response. The polished pieces clicked softly against the board. Tick, 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 like the sound of a clock nobody could see. One of the guests finally whispered, "Is that good?" Daniel did not take his eyes off the game. The boy knows exactly what he is doing. The answer spread through the crowd faster than expected. Suddenly people were paying closer attention. Richard heard it. His jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before relaxing again. He moved a knight. Ethan responded almost instantly. Richard's fingers remained resting on the piece a moment longer than before. Not long enough to attract attention. Long enough to notice if you were looking. Ethan was looking. Then something unexpected happened. Richard stopped smiling. The expression simply vanished. Not dramatically, quietly, like a light being switched off in another room. Daniel leaned forward. The position on the board had become complicated. White still looked comfortable, strong, even. Yet there was a hidden tension running beneath the surface. Ethan could feel it. Richard could feel it too. One path led forward. Another led into trouble. Most players would not see the difference for several moves. Ethan saw it already. Richard studied the board for the first time since the match began. Really studied it. The crowd sensed the change immediately. Conversations disappeared. Phones lowered. Nobody wanted to miss what came next. Then Richard finally made his move. Ethan looked down at the new position. And for the first time all evening, a memory surfaced. An old voice. Calm. Patient. Teaching. Never rushing. He could almost hear it. Sometimes the strongest move is the one your opponent believes you cannot see. Ethan's eyes settled on a single square. His fingers reached toward a piece. And somewhere above the fireplace, beneath the chandelier light, Arthur Holloway's photograph seemed to watch in silence. Ethan's fingers settled on the piece as though it already belonged on its destination square. He moved it without hesitation. The click echoed softly across the table. Richard's eyes dropped immediately to the board. The billionaire's expression remained composed, but something behind it shifted. Daniel Mercer saw it first. A tiny pause, barely noticeable, the kind that appeared when a person expected one thing and found another. Richard leaned forward. His gaze traced the position from left to right, then back again. Ethan sat quietly. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at Richard. He looked only at the board. The room remained silent. Even the servers moving between tables seemed careful not to make noise. Interesting, Richard said at last. The words sounded casual. His voice did not. He reached for a bishop and adjusted its position. Another move. Another click. Ethan responded almost immediately. The crowd exchanged glances. A few people who knew nothing about chess were beginning to understand something anyway. The game was not unfolding the way they expected. One guest whispered, "How many moves has it been?" 8. Daniel answered without looking away from the board. "Only 8. Richard heard him. His eyes narrowed slightly. 8 moves. Such a small number. Yet the position already carried unusual tension. White still held material equality. Nothing dramatic had happened. No spectacular sacrifice. No obvious mistake. But the balance felt different now. The center of the board seemed to belong to Ethan. The open lines seemed to favor him. Most important of all, Richard had stopped controlling the pace. Ethan remembered another rainy afternoon years ago. He had been 9. A chessboard sat between him and an older man whose silver hair caught the sunlight near the apartment window. The man had never spoken loudly, never rushed a lesson. The goal is not to attack your opponent, the voice had said. The goal is to make him walk where you want him to walk. Ethan blinked once. The memory faded. The board remained. Richard took longer on his next move. Not much longer. Just enough for people to notice. One woman checked her watch. Another guest lowered his phone and focused completely on the table. Daniel folded his arms tighter. Then Richard moved a knight. Ethan's eyes settled on the position. There it was. The path he had seen 3 moves earlier. Quiet. Hidden. Waiting. He reached forward. Monica felt her breath catch from across the room. She knew that look. The same look he wore during state finals. During championship matches. During moments when every piece seemed connected by invisible threads only he could see. Ethan moved. The sound of wood touching wood seemed louder than before. Richard froze. Not physically. Mentally. His gaze locked onto the board. The room waited. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. Nobody spoke. Daniel slowly straightened. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Richard's eyes moved from one square to another, then another. The confidence that had carried him through the evening began to crack around the edges. Not enough for everyone to see. Enough for a few people. Enough for Ethan. Across the room, the photograph above the fireplace watched over the silent crowd. And for the first time all night, Richard Whitmore looked less like a man hosting a gala and more like a man searching desperately for an answer. Richard remained motionless. The room waited with him. His eyes moved across the board again and again, searching for something that should have been there and was not. The easy continuation he expected had disappeared. In its place stood a position that felt strangely unfamiliar. One guest shifted nervously. Another quietly set down a glass on a nearby table. The sound seemed unusually loud. Ethan sat perfectly still. His hands rested in his lap. His breathing remained calm. He had already seen the position several moves ahead. For him, the tension no longer lived on the board. It lived in the people watching it. Daniel Mercer glanced toward Richard for a moment. Then back to the pieces. The billionaire was taking much longer than before. Everything all right? One guest asked with a nervous smile. Richard laughed lightly. The sound came a fraction too late. Of course. He adjusted his cufflink. The kid made an interesting move. Interesting. The word spread quietly through the crowd. A few people smiled. Others exchanged glances. Earlier in the evening, Richard had spoken about the game as though it were a performance. Now he was analyzing it. The difference was small. The meaning was not. Richard leaned forward again. The chandelier light reflected off the polished board. His fingers hovered over one piece, then another. Twice he reached toward a move before stopping. Ethan noticed every hesitation. So did Daniel. Finally, Richard selected a continuation and made his move. The piece clicked into place. Several guests released breaths they did not realize they had been holding. Ethan lowered his eyes to the new position. For a brief second, the ballroom disappeared again. He remembered sitting at a small kitchen table years earlier. Rain tapping softly against apartment windows. A chessboard between him and the older man with silver hair. Most players look for attacks, the man had said. The strongest players look for truth. The board never lies. People do. Ethan had not understood those words when he was younger. He understood them now. His gaze settled on the center of the board. Richard's move looked active, confident, strong. It also created a weakness. Small, hidden, permanent. Ethan reached forward. His fingers closed around a knight. The movement was smooth and immediate. No calculation visible. No uncertainty. Just certainty. The piece landed. Click. Silence followed. Complete silence. Richard's eyes snapped downward. Daniel straightened instantly. Across the room, Monica felt her pulse quicken. She knew that move. Not the exact position. The feeling. The moment when a game stopped being equal and started leaning in one direction. Richard stared. 5 seconds. 10. 15. His smile was gone now. Entirely gone. The crowd noticed. A woman near the back lowered her phone. Another guest quietly whispered, "What happened?" Daniel answered without taking his eyes off the board. He just walked into something. Richard heard him. A faint line appeared along his jaw. For the first time all evening, he no longer looked like a billionaire entertaining guests at a charity gala. He looked like a competitor realizing the person across from him was not who he thought. And as his gaze moved from the board to Ethan and back again, another realization began forming in the back of his mind. He had seen this style before. Years ago. Long before tonight. Long before the crowd. Long before the photograph hanging above the fireplace. The thought arrived quietly, then refused to leave. Richard stared at the board as though it had changed while he was looking at it. The position remained the same. The problem did not. A faint crease appeared between his brows. One of the wealthiest men in the room had suddenly become the least comfortable. The crowd felt it. Nobody could explain why, but they felt it. The air seemed heavier now. Even the soft jazz drifting from hidden speakers sounded distant. Richard leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly through his nose. His gaze returned to Ethan. The boy remained perfectly calm. No celebration. No confidence on display. No attempt to intimidate. That bothered Richard more than arrogance ever could. Across the room, Monica watched silently. She had stopped worrying about whether Ethan belonged at the table. Now she was worried about something else entirely. She recognized the look on her son's face. It was the same expression he wore when he already knew the answer and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Daniel Mercer stepped closer. "How many moves?" someone whispered. Daniel studied the board. 10. The number hung in the air. Only 10 moves. Yet Richard had already spent more time thinking during the last few minutes than he had during the entire opening. The billionaire lowered his eyes again. His fingers hovered above a rook before pulling away. Then a knight. Then a pawn. Nothing felt right. Every continuation seemed to lead somewhere uncomfortable. Every path appeared to narrow. And beneath it all was that growing feeling he could not shake. Familiarity. The structure on the board. The patience. The hidden pressure. It reminded him of someone. A memory surfaced from decades earlier. A crowded tournament hall. Hundreds of spectators. The sound of chess clocks clicking. A younger Richard standing beside a board, watching a master dismantle opponents without appearing to attack at all. Arthur Holloway. The realization struck so suddenly that Richard blinked. He looked toward the photograph above the fireplace. Then back to Ethan. Then back to the board. Daniel noticed. Something wrong. Richard laughed softly, but there was no amusement in it. No. Yet his voice lacked conviction. Ethan remained silent. The crowd remained silent. Richard finally made his move. The piece clicked into place. Immediately he knew he disliked it. Not because it was losing, because it felt forced. Ethan looked down. His eyes moved across the board once. Then twice. Less than 3 seconds later, he reached forward. Another piece moved. Another quiet click echoed through the ballroom. Richard froze. This time the reaction was impossible to hide. His head lifted slightly. His eyes widened just enough for Daniel to notice. The billionaire looked back at the position. Then again. Then a third time. The room held its breath. "What is it?" one guest asked quietly. Daniel's gaze never left the board. "He is running out of good choices." A murmur passed through the crowd. Richard heard it. So did Ethan. But only one of them seemed unaffected. The chandelier light reflected across the polished surface of the board. White pieces stood active and coordinated. Black pieces appeared crowded, restricted, trapped by decisions made several moves earlier. Richard swallowed once. A tiny movement, barely visible. Yet for the first time that evening, he understood something the rest of the room had not. This was no longer a friendly exhibition. This was a fight for control of the board. And somehow, somewhere during the first 10 moves, he had already lost control of it. The silence around the table had become something tangible. It pressed against the walls of the ballroom and settled over the crowd like a storm that had not yet decided whether to break. Richard stared at the board. The polished pieces reflected the chandelier light, but he barely noticed. His attention was trapped inside the position. Every line he calculated seemed to end in the same place. Pressure, restriction, fewer options, less room to breathe. Across from him, Ethan remained motionless. A 14-year-old boy sitting in a chair that looked too large for him, wearing a simple gray jacket among people whose shoes cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. Yet somehow he looked completely at home. Richard glanced toward the photograph above the fireplace again. Arthur Holloway's calm eyes stared back from another era. The resemblance was not physical. It was something else. The patience. The refusal to rush. The feeling that every move had been prepared long before it appeared on the board. Richard swallowed and returned his focus to the game. He had one practical continuation left. One narrow path. He found it after nearly a minute and pushed the piece forward. Click. The sound seemed louder than ever. Nobody spoke. Ethan lowered his eyes. His gaze moved once across the position, then stopped. Daniel Mercer felt a chill run through him. He had seen that look before in strong players. Not excitement. Recognition. The expression of someone who had just arrived exactly where he intended to go. Ethan reached forward. His fingers closed around a piece. The move came instantly. No hesitation. No calculation visible from the outside. Just certainty. Click. Richard froze. Completely froze. This time there was no hiding it. His eyes widened. The color drained slightly from his face. Several guests looked from him to the board and back again. They did not understand chess well enough to understand the position, but they understood people. And Richard Whitmore suddenly looked like a man who had received bad news. Daniel leaned closer. His eyes scanned the board. Then he exhaled slowly. Oh, the single word drew immediate attention. Someone near him whispered, "What?" Daniel did not answer right away. His gaze remained fixed on the position. White pieces controlled every important square. Black pieces stood awkwardly arranged, unable to support one another. The board no longer looked balanced. It looked inevitable. Richard saw it too. Move after move unfolded in his mind. Every variation ended the same way. Different roads. Same destination. A memory surfaced again. A tournament held decades earlier. Arthur Holloway standing from the table after a victory and quietly saying, "The game was decided 3 moves ago. We simply had not reached the ending yet." Richard had never forgotten those words. Now they echoed inside his head with uncomfortable clarity. He looked up at Ethan. For the first time all evening, there was no trace of amusement in his expression. No performance. No charm. Only a question he could not answer. "Who are you?" Ethan did not speak. He simply looked back at the board. Because the answer was already there, hidden among 64 squares. And as Richard's eyes returned to the position one final time, he realized something that made his stomach sink. The trap he had been searching for was real. Worse than that, he had walked into it willingly. Richard's gaze remained fixed on the board long after everyone else had stopped pretending to understand it. The room had become utterly silent. No laughter, no whispers, no clinking glasses. Just the soft hum of the ballroom air system and the distant glow of city lights beyond the windows. The billionaire slowly leaned back in his chair. For the first time all evening, he looked tired. Not physically, mentally, like a man carrying a question too heavy to ignore. Ethan sat across from him without moving. The pieces stood frozen between them. White controlled the center. Black struggled for space. The position felt less like a contest and more like a truth gradually revealing itself. Daniel Mercer studied the board one final time and shook his head almost imperceptibly. He had seen enough. Richard noticed. "You see it too?" he asked quietly. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "I think you already do." The answer settled over the table. Richard looked back down. A memory surfaced with startling clarity. Nearly 20 years earlier. A private tournament reception in New York. Arthur Holloway standing beside a window overlooking the Hudson River. Richard had been younger then. Ambitious. Eager to impress. He remembered boasting about business victories and future acquisitions. Arthur had listened politely before saying something Richard never forgot. There is a difference between winning and understanding why you won. At the time, Richard had dismissed the comment. Now it returned with uncomfortable force. His eyes drifted toward the photograph above the fireplace. Then toward Ethan. Then back to Monica, standing near the edge of the crowd. Suddenly, another memory surfaced. Not from a tournament. From a charity fundraiser years ago. Arthur had arrived with a young woman and a small boy. Richard remembered speaking with donors that night. He remembered barely paying attention. He remembered the boy sitting quietly beside a chessboard while adults ignored him. A strange feeling settled into Richard's chest. He looked carefully at Monica, then at Ethan. Something connected. Not completely. Just enough. "How long have you been playing?" Richard asked. The question surprised everyone. Ethan lifted his eyes. "Since I was 6. Richard nodded slowly. "Who taught you?" Monica's hands tightened instantly. Daniel noticed. So did Ethan. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Ethan glanced toward the photograph hanging above the fireplace. Richard followed his gaze. The realization arrived like a door quietly opening somewhere deep inside his mind. He stared at the photograph, then back at Ethan, then at Monica. His face changed. Not shock. Recognition. "No," he whispered. The word escaped before he could stop it. Monica lowered her eyes. The silence that followed felt endless. Richard stood slowly from his chair. Nobody understood why. The crowd simply watched. The billionaire walked toward the fireplace. He stopped beneath Arthur Holloway's photograph and stared up at it. Every detail suddenly seemed different. Every memory suddenly clearer. He turned back toward the table, toward Ethan, toward Monica. "Arthur," he said quietly, almost to himself. Daniel's eyes widened. Several guests exchanged confused glances. Ethan remained seated, calm, patient. Richard looked at the board again, then at the boy. And in that moment, he realized the game in front of him was not merely a game. It was an echo from a past he thought had been forgotten. A lesson returning after 20 years. And for the first time that night, Richard Whitmore began to understand why the position felt so familiar. The ballroom remained silent as Richard Whitmore slowly returned to the table. No one stopped him. No one spoke. Hundreds of eyes followed his every movement. The billionaire sat down and looked at the board one last time. The position had not changed. Neither had the truth. For several seconds he simply stared. Then, with a quiet breath, he reached forward and gently tipped his king onto its side. The sound was soft, barely audible, yet it seemed to echo through the entire room. Nobody moved. Nobody knew what to say. Daniel Mercer closed his eyes briefly and nodded. Monica pressed a hand against her chest. Ethan remained exactly where he was. Calm, respectful, silent. Richard looked across the board at him. There was no anger in his face now. No pride. No performance. Only honesty. Checkmate, he said quietly. The words settled over the room. A few guests exchanged stunned looks. Others stared at Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. The 14-year-old boy they had ignored all evening had just defeated the most powerful man in the room without raising his voice once. Richard glanced toward Monica. You knew? Monica hesitated, then nodded. I knew he was gifted. Richard gave a small laugh. Gifted? He looked back at the board. That is one word for it. His gaze drifted upward toward Arthur Holloway's photograph. For a long moment he said nothing. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded older somehow. Arthur used to tell me that talent reveals character. He smiled sadly. I never understood what he meant. Ethan listened quietly. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded sheet of paper. It was the donation agreement prepared earlier in the evening. He signed it without hesitation. Then he handed it to Daniel. $1 million, Richard said. Exactly as promised. Directly to the educational program of Monica Brooks' choosing. The crowd broke into applause. Not loud at first. Then stronger, warmer, genuine. Monica looked overwhelmed. Her eyes glistened beneath the chandelier light. Richard waited for the applause to fade before turning back to Ethan. There is something else I owe you. Ethan said nothing. Richard reached into his pocket again and removed the $20 bill he had seen Ethan place on the table earlier. He stared at it for a moment, then carefully set it in front of the boy. I was wrong. The room fell silent once more. Those 3 words carried more weight than all the speeches Richard had given that night. Ethan looked at the bill, then at Richard. Finally, he picked it up and folded it once. Not with anger, not with triumph, just acceptance. My mother taught me something, Ethan said softly. Richard listened. So did everyone else. People show you who they are when they think you have nothing they need. No one spoke. Richard lowered his eyes. The truth landed exactly where it belonged. Outside the windows, the lights of Chicago shimmered against the darkness. Inside, the crowd slowly began to disperse. Conversations returned. Glasses clinked. Music drifted softly through the ballroom again. Yet something had changed. Not the building, not the city, not even the people. Just one heart. Richard stood quietly beneath Arthur Holloway's photograph long after most guests had left. Across the room, Monica and Ethan walked toward the exit together. Neither looked back. The chandelier light reflected briefly across the chessboard before fading into shadow. The pieces remained exactly where they had been left. Silent. Still. And somewhere in that silence lingered a lesson worth far more than $1 million. Integrity does not depend on status. It never did.